All right. Good evening, good day, everybody. My name is Alina Stenerson, and I am president of Minnesota Marvelous Women's Club. Today, we have an interview with George Maxwell, an immigration attorney. George, I'd like to pass on the microphone to you to get introduced and introduce the topic that we'll be discussing today.
Well, thank you, Minnesota Marvelous Women's Club and Alina, for inviting me to talk. I am an immigration attorney at the Breen Law Firm here in Minneapolis. My general focus tends to be employment and family-based immigration, but I'm here to talk to you about some recent developments that have come out for Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. These are programs that are about a month old. So we're kind of just going to go over the basics and also talk about and provide kind of an overview of the U.S. immigration system from a very high level. The idea is to get people to start thinking about the options that might be available for them and some strategic decisions that they may have in the future. And so with that, it's May 11th. A stormy May 11th, I might add, May of 2022. And on to the overview. Can you, next slide? So from a very high level, the US immigration system kind of breaks down into two big groups, US citizens, and then everyone else who isn't a US citizen. Those non-US citizens, and they're statutorily called aliens, didn't mean they came from Mars or anything like that, are kind of break down into two big groups. Immigrants, those are lawful permanent residents, refugees, asylees, people who have a permanent right to live, work, and stay in the United States indefinitely. Those three groups kind of fall into that. Then you have what's called non-immigrants. Non-immigrants are folks that are here in the United States for a temporary short-term purpose. Usually, many of them are here if they're here in status and lawfully on a non-immigrant alphabet letter status classification. We'll get into what those are in a little bit. Or they're a person that's not necessarily in a non-immigrant alphabet status classification, but they have what's called permission to be in the United States if they're here lawfully, okay? We're kind of going to focus on the people who are here lawfully. So then another big kind of overhead thought or thing to focus on, statuses and visas, commonly mistaken. Okay, people think visa is your sticker in your passport that allows you to approach the border and request to be admitted into a particular status. You need it if you're trying to get in and request that status. If you're already in the United States, maybe you don't need it unless you plan to internationally travel. But most importantly, your visa is not your immigration status. Next slide, please. So immigration status, right? Two basic types, temporary, permanent. Common statuses that have work permission. These are things people who come to the United States want. They want permission to stay and work. So they're temporary, what's called restricted. And by restricted, I mean they're restricted usually in time, and they have lots of rules that you have to follow if you're going to continue to be in status, and you want to extend that status, so extend your stay so it's longer than your initial approval, or you want to change status from one kind of status to another. So these temporary statuses all have alphabets. So H is usually for work, L is intercompany transferees, TNs is a special status for Mexicans and Canadian professionals, E's are investors or treaty traders based on treaty trade. O's are people of extraordinary ability. R's are religious workers. F's, all the F1s, F1 OPT, F1 CPT, STEM OPT, those are all some form of international student studying in the United States and they have a goal, a degree, or a diploma they're trying to earn. And those various designations basically are some designation that allows them to work. Temporary unrestricted, pending adjustments for applicants. So people who are trying to get permanent residence can get temporary work authorization. And some other forms, DACA and humanitarian aid, asylum, people applying for asylum can get temporary work authorization. Permanent unrestricted, you can work anywhere, you can do anything. Lawful permanent residents, refugees, asylees. Common misconceptions, as I mentioned before, between statuses and visas. It is possible to have a valid visa and not be in legal status. That's because you came to the United States, were admitted in a status, and then you violated one of the rules of that status. And when you violated one of the rules of that status, you can't extend your status, and you can't, you may not be able to extend your status, and you may not be able to change your status. Possible to have a valid status and an expired visa. Yes, that's true. That's usually not a problem unless you actually want to travel, as I mentioned. Okay, next slide, please. So main government agencies when immigration is involved: Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, CBP, Customs and Border are people that meet you at the border. USCIS are the folks that adjudicate the benefits. ICE, those are the enforcers that come around if you have violated status or you're unlawfully. TSA, Transportation and Security Administration, those are the people who do the pat-down searches, and they're also involved in some aspects with moving goods. Department of Labor, those tend to regulate wages and labor certifications. Department of State, they basically adjudicate visas, both immigrant and non-immigrant outside the United States. Next slide. Topics. So as I mentioned at the top of our hour, our topics are some recent programs. These things are less than a month old. One is a discussion about options for Ukrainian F1 students in status and in the United States as of April 19th. And these dates really do matter. And we'll get into how those dates might change in the future. Uniting for the Ukraine, short-term solutions for Ukrainians outside the United States who fled the Ukraine and were in the Ukraine on or after February 11th. Temporary protected status, short-term solution for Ukrainians in the United States if they were here in the United States as of April 11th, okay? So on to the next slide. So a discussion, a note about options. Ukrainians outside the United States should carefully consider and compare their refugee benefits that they have in their European countries that they happen to be in to whatever opportunities you might have in the United States. I want to highlight that. Why? Because many of it depends largely on which European country you're in trying to claim refugee status. Some of those can make it harder than others. Some of those have better benefits than others. So you want to kind of understand what that option might be, because it actually might be pretty good compared to whatever it is you might get here in the United States, okay? So you want to kind of understand what that is, wherever that refugee happens to be, if they're not in the US already. And then you also, before you take big steps, I'm a firm believer in getting the individual potential immigrant or immigrant's situation assessed. Depending on the particular facts of each individual, they will have potentially many different options. And they should have an opportunity to weigh what those options are, both how long it might take and what the risks are to some of these options, because each option has its own risks. And also how that fits into whatever your long-term or short-term strategy might be. Some options might be okay as a short-term strategy, might not work out so well on a long-term basis. Vice versa, some options might take a long time, even though they sound good and might actually be good if you can get them in place. But you may want to take action faster than that option can come into realization. And so you need to seek out and get your own individual evaluation from an experienced immigration attorney before you make any big strategic decisions. Highlighting that, I'm going to talk today about TPS, which is temporary protected status, and humanitarian parole, which is what a form of Uniting for Ukraine is. These things by themselves are generally designed to be short-term solutions. And they may not be great from a long-term perspective, depending on how things turn out. Sometimes TPS can be renewed and renewed and renewed over and over again. So it looks like it potentially could be long-term, but also it can lead to nail-biting scenarios where you're waiting until the last minute for somebody to extend your TPS. So you kind of got to know what you're getting yourself into. And there could be limited or less options available for how to get from here to there if you want a longer term solution. All right, so having said all that, and I'm also going to note that I'm not going to cover how some Ukrainians might qualify as F1 students or H1Bs or H2Bs or these other, shall we say, alphabet non-immigrant statuses that might qualify for some people, just because I don't have enough time. I could talk for a long time, longer than you may want to listen, but those are kind of things to bring up if you seek out the advice of an experienced immigration lawyer. I might mention about the hazards of trying to come on a B1, B2 visitor visa towards the end. And then it's, as I mentioned before, and I'll repeat it here again, it's May 2022. So these programs are relatively new. Things about them will likely change. One of the things that's constant about immigration, even though Congress can't pass a new comprehensive immigration reform, it does from time to time tweak things. And more importantly, the president and the Department of Homeland Security are constantly changing different rules, how rules are applied. And so things change constantly. So you need to be aware that the further out you are from the date of this video, the more likely you will want to definitely check with somebody to see what might have changed. All right, next slide, please. So let's first talk about F1 students. I love F1 students. Advise a lot of some universities and colleges and F1 students. So F1 students are usually here pursuing a degree or a diploma of some sort. And within the regulations, there are various ways to get work authorization. And one of the sets of regulations allows the administration in certain circumstances, Department of Homeland Security, to recognize that people from particular countries may have been impacted or suffered severe economic hardship. And they did that for the Ukrainians on April 19th, okay? That's a very important date to remember for now. So on that date, they rolled out a regulation that designated that if you're a Ukrainian citizen, you're lawfully present in the United States in F1 status, you're enrolled, which means you're enrolled in an F1 program and you're pursuing some kind of degree. So that could be a high school diploma even, but it usually means a bachelor's or an associate's or a master's or a PhD of some sort. So you're maintaining your F1 status. You can go to your designated school official. That's your international student advisor usually, but they're also called a designated school official. And you'll want to talk to them about that. That's the person you want to talk to because they're the first step in potentially getting this work authorization. and so that you can go to work for more hours than are normally approved for a student. So you go to your designated school official and you basically request this severe economic hardship, and that will then be entered into your I-20. You'll get an I-20. There are different versions of how this works. One is if you just want to work on campus 40 hours a week, you could do that if you wanted to. So you could get that severe economic hardship. You have to go to the DSO first. Don't start working 40 hours a week without going to your DSO. That will be a no-no, okay? Go to your DSO. If you get approved, you can work up to 40 hours on campus work authorization. And you can also request a reduction in the number of hours that you need to be enrolled, okay? Depends on whether you're pursuing a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree. If it's a bachelor's, you can reduce from 12 hours to 6. If it's a graduate degree, you can reduce from whatever they consider to be full-time to 3 hours, okay? You can also use this severe economic hardship to request an EAD to work authorization. So you get an I-20, you submit an I-765 form with your filing fee and the various documents that need to go along with that. You file it. You don't actually get to go to work until the EAD arrives, which means you could be waiting a few months, but you can get that, and then you can have work authorization to work outside of school, off campus for somebody for 40 hours a week. And there are ways to use this in conjunction with also using TPS. I'll kind of touch on that when we get to the TPS part. The thing to know is this current severe economic hardship is currently valid only through October 19th, 2023. That's 18 months. Not surprising. It also won't be surprising if in October 19th of 2023 or before that date, if situation in Ukraine hasn't significantly improved, I would predict that the administration may issue an extension for another 18 months. I don't know if that's true or not, but watch that space. That could happen. All right, next slide. Uniting for the Ukraine. So this is a humanitarian parole style program. And basically it's an expedited way to get humanitarian parole. There's another way, but I won't get into that. This is basically a brand new program which was rolled out on April 25th. You can go to the website, Uniting for Ukraine, USCIS, don't go anywhere else. That's the main that has the program and explains how to apply. It's a process to sponsor. So you got to have a US person. By that, I mean somebody in the United States. We'll get into who qualifies as a sponsor. It's actually pretty broad. Who's a sponsor in the United States, and the Ukrainians you want to sponsor have to be outside the United States, okay? If it's approved, they may be paroled into the United States for up to 2 years, okay? With work authorization. What does that mean? It means that you can apply for work authorization. Once again, you have to wait for the EAD card to arrive before you can start to work. The process basically avoids needing to go to the vastly overburdened US embassies to apply for visas, which have a long queue for lots of reasons I won't go into. And there is a way, if it's done by individual, to use the www.myuscis.gov website to basically manage most of the process. Next slide, please. So who can qualify? It's extremely broad. So someone who is in lawful status in the United States, that means they're here legally, okay? A parolee or a beneficiary of deferred enforcement departure or deferred action, so DACA. So basically you have some basis for being in the United States, and you probably are have some work authorization. And they will, each sponsor who applies, submits, will have to pass security and background vetting check. You have to demonstrate that you have sufficient financial resources, and you do that by filing an I-134 form, which you fill out It's not the same as the affidavit of support that you would put in for an immigrant. So do not use an I-864 form. Different form, different obligations. You want the I-134 form, okay, which is usually simpler, although admittedly the form is a little confusing. So examples of people who qualify: U.S. citizens and nationals, lawful permanent residents, non-immigrants, asylees, refugees, and parolees, TPS holders, beneficiaries of deferred action. So a large number of people. In fact, you could be here as a parolee with work authorization. If you have sufficient income, you may be able to sponsor someone else. We'll leave that for hypothetical for another day. Next slide, please. Beneficiaries. Who can you sponsor? Okay, Ukrainian citizens, also people who are stateless that were living in Ukraine, but that aside, their immediate family members, which usually means unmarried children under the age of 21, okay? Unaccompanied children, so children without a parent, this is not a program that you can use for that, okay? They're a Ukrainian citizen and they have to possess a valid Ukrainian passport. The children could be included in their parents' passport. That's an important wrinkle. So what happens if the Ukrainian you want to sponsor doesn't have a passport? My advice, call the local Ukrainian embassy in the country in which they are at and ask them to help get a Ukrainian passport for the person. My understanding is they have some ability to address these things. They have to be currently outside the United States. They have to reside in the Ukraine immediately before the Russian invasion. At least they couldn't have fled before February 11th of 2022, all right? And were displaced as a result of the invasion. And obviously you have somebody in the United States who's filed a form I-834, and the Ukrainian beneficiaries have to pass biometric and biometric security checks. That will include also a vaccine testament requirement. Okay, next. How is this done? So the first step is you get a supporter that files an I-834 form, declaration of financial support. There's no filing fee for the I-834 as of yet. I don't expect there will be, but the I-834 does come with some potential financial exposure in the sense that you are making some promises, the supporter or sponsor is making some promises to the US government about what they're willing to provide, and there's a space where you note what it is you're willing to provide. So you want to read it carefully before you sign anything, and understand, maybe seek advice as to exactly what the consequences will be of signing it. The I-834 form is an old form. It's created for lots of different uses. They just chose this one. So one of the things that you want to make sure is you are not going to check the myself as beneficiary box because you're sponsoring someone else, and then follow the directions accordingly after that. To fill out, you'll need your information about the Ukrainian family and their income and assets, and also your income and assets. The sponsor supporter will need to list all the current dependents, your income and assets, and must disclose that it's filed another I-834 as a source of income. So if you file for multiple people, you'll have to mention that. It's also possible, I understand, if you yourself don't have enough income, you can work with other people to get together, and together you guys can file separate I-134s for one large family, for instance. There's some details on the Uniting for Ukraine website for how to do that, okay? And you'll probably want to provide some supporting documents, tax return, bank and financial statements that kind of back up the statements that you've made about your financial ability. My overall guess, although it's not explicitly stated, is that where they use the I-134 form, in other contexts, they tend to take the 100% of poverty guidelines. And you can find that on the Department of Health and Human Services puts out poverty guidelines based on family size. And so to find out whether you meet 100%, you would find out what is the total number of your family, and then add the number of dependents, which means the number of people that you want to sponsor, and look up that number and see if your income or assets equal that number. Then you'll probably have a good gauge as to what your potential chances of success are. So you file that. Next slide, please. You file that. It can be filed online if it's done individually. USCIS then reviews it and decides whether the income or assets are sufficient or insufficient, and they let you know. If it's sufficient, then USCIS will email your Ukrainian beneficiaries outside the United States, which means they need to have access to some kind of device that they can get their email on. And they need to also be looking for this email because it may resemble spam. Okay, so you need to look for your email coming from the myuscis.gov website. That will invite them to set up their own myUSCIS account with double verification and all of that stuff. Don't lose your password. And they'll need to confirm their basic biometric information, attest to the family relationships in their family, and also attest on the vaccine requirements that they have measles, polio, and at least one dose COVID vaccine. USCIS then processes it, and it can issue through myUSCIS, or at least that's the plan, an approved authorization to travel, which they then print out and would be valid for 90 days. They then they then fly to the United States, show their passports plus the authorization, and they can be admitted for up to 2 years on parole. And once here, then they can fill out an I-765 form with fee. It is possible to file and request a fee waiver, I will mention, with appropriate supporting documents, and ask for that work authorization for that two-year period. Do not go to work until you get your work authorization. All right, next slide, please. Oops, TPS. So the other program, and the thing to know about TPS is it's been around for a long time. The big thing, the reason that this door opened for Ukrainians is, as it has for many other people from many other countries who have unfortunate circumstances, either due to war or some kind of other humanitarian disaster, there's a statutory authority that allows the president and the Department of Homeland Security to designate certain countries for temporary protected status. So what is that? And as I mentioned before, there is a way to use this in conjunction with your other temporary statuses, like for instance, the F1 severe economic hardship that I mentioned earlier, and we'll get into that a little bit, and why, if you are in status, that it may be wise for you to maintain status even while you have temporary protected status. So what is temporary protected status? It's a short-term protection, usually in 18 months in increments. And it basically protects the person from removal, deportation, basically in common parlance called deportation, from the United States for designated foreign citizens or nationals who have been continuously present in the United States from a particular date. And the date is very important. The date is stated when they designate for TPS. So people with TPS can submit an additional application and fee and get work authorization. And there's some benefits to having TPS or work authorization, or potentially maybe some other types of work authorization. And you can also request travel authorization, but that's a separate filing and a separate fee. Extensions of TPS can occur. Sometimes, particularly in the Trump era, the TPS designation would not get renewed or extended for another 18 months until nearly the last minute. Some administrations are better than others, and admittedly, as whatever it is caused the TPS designation to be to roll out fades away, there's a greater risk that your TPS may not be extended. And it's highly discretionary. They can choose to not extend it, just not extend it, which is what happened during the Trump era. There were a number of countries that lost their TPS designations despite significant amount of lobbying and so forth. Not all of them did, but a number of them did. And that caused, particularly for people who hadn't maintained their underlying non-immigrant status, that caused some significant problems. And while the Biden administration is probably going to take a softer tone on these kind of things, it will depend quite a bit on what kind of administration you would get potentially in 2024, who might be elected. Is there going to be? It depends on what happen to be their stance on immigration. Next slide, please. TPS. So people with TPS, if they're in the United States on a non-immigrant status, can, as I mentioned, can and should maintain that non-immigrant status. You can, which basically means that you get TPS, but you then try to also keep your activities within those authorized by the non-immigrant status. Because when TPS terminates, you fall back into that non-immigrant status if you have maintained it, or if you have changed to some other non-immigrant status, you fall into whatever that status is. And that status can also provide you with many plethora of different opportunities. If you have not maintained lawful non-immigrant status and you have no other status to fall into, well, then you could become unlawfully present in the United States, which, if it sounds bad, it is bad. And that can make you removable, deportable, and have all kinds of other consequences. So that's why it's best, if possible, to maintain that non-immigrant status if one can while you're on TPS. All right, next. So TPS for Ukraine was first announced. If in April you felt like you had a deja vu moment when they came out with TPS, it's because they had announced TPS earlier. They'd announced it on March 3rd, 2022, and they had a date. Well, the good news is for everybody who arrived after that March date, that you got some more breathing space. The new announcement on March 19th will allow some people who came in March and up until April 11th to the United States to apply for TPS. You have to be Ukrainian national or a stateless person who last lived in Ukraine. You file an I-821 with fee. I think you can also file a fee waiver if it applies to you, with the required evidence. The registration period is from April 19th, 2022 to October 19th, 2023. So if you want to file that, you need to file it within the authorized period. You have to show, the Ukrainian national has to show that they've been continuously present in the United States since April 11th, 2022. That is an extremely important date for this designation. And then you have to pass security and background checks. What does that mean? Well, there are some disqualifiers. I will list some of them, okay? You can't be convicted of a felony or 2 or more misdemeanors in the United States. What does that mean? That means if you're here on TPS and you happen to have a chance, because TPS gets redesignated, be careful about misdemeanor violations. In particular, I know of some sad cases where people who had driving while under the influence catch up with them. A ground of admissibility, you're subject to a bar for asylum. Usually that means that you were participated in violating the rights of other people. It also encompasses a lot of other things, criminal and whatnot. If TPS is granted, you need to make sure that you don't, that you need to make sure that you do re-register for TPS, or if you fail to re-register, you have some good cause, okay? So if you're on TPS, it's granted, and you want to stay on TPS, you need to make sure to re-register during the new re-registration period. And if you do not meet the continuous presence requirement or fail to file in the registration period, obviously it's not going to go well for you in your application for TPS. Next slide, please. So key dates. I want to go over these dates. They're very important, particularly with TPS. Your registration period for the current designation is April 19th, 2022 to October 19th, 2023. You have to have been Ukrainian national or citizen, has to be able to demonstrate continuous presence from April 11th onward. So if you arrived after April 11th, this current TPS designation period is not going to work for you. Now, I do have some potential news. They rolled out, you'll notice that they rolled out the first designation in March, and then they rolled out another designation in April. It's possible, if you watch this space, there could be another designation. Do I know that for sure? I do not. But chances are, particularly if the war drags on, it's possible that you'll get another TPS designation. That designation might not be until sometime just before October 19th of 2023, which is a long wait. It could be sooner. During the registration period, if you're Ukrainian, you want TPS, submit the form and the fee. If you want work authorization, submit the I-765 form and with supporting documents. And if you want to travel, submit the I-131 form, okay? 3 different forms to allow you to do 3 different things. You need to file the first one, the TPS form, if you want to claim TPS. All right, next slide, please. So before we get into the local resources and nonprofit groups, I want to kind of touch on a couple of other things. It is possible to use that F1 severe economic hardship in conjunction with TPS. You'll want to talk to your designated student, your DSO, your designated school official about that. It also may be possible to continue to be an F1 and get TPS and even get TPS work authorization, but you'll want to coordinate that carefully with your designated school official before you do that. So big note here. If you're an F1 student and you want to stay in status, you absolutely have to go to your international student advisor and talk to the designated school official. That individual is key to helping you maintain your F1 student status and how you can make changes if you get authorization ahead of time. Permission ahead of time with U.S. immigration. Do not try, it's usually not advisable to try and ask for forgiveness later. That's technically possible in some circumstances, but it's not a great position to put yourself in, and it can lead to denials. So that's why permission ahead of time, not trying to ask for mercy later. So local resources and nonprofit groups where you can seek out assistance if you need it, and also if you can't afford the services of an experienced immigration lawyer. One of these, a very good one that's been around for a long time, is the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. There's contact information for Austin and Kathy there. I know them well. There's also a link to their own fact sheet on TPS. It's a good source of information. And they also have a Facebook event that they're coordinating for the week of May 16th. So look out for that. Advocates for Human Rights, also another good local resource here in Minneapolis. We are blessed to have many, and this is a good one. So you should reach out to them. They have regular listening events. Mainly you can go find them through their Facebook events page. You can also figure out how to contact them through their Facebook page as well. Volunteer Lawyers Network, VLN, it's been around for a long time. They have an intake line. They line up pro bono attorneys throughout across all kinds of law firms who pro bono will donate their time, and their hours of operation are there. Next slide. Local government services. Again, we are blessed, particularly in the Minneapolis area, to have cities that have departments that focus on these issues. I know Michelle Rivero, and she's a good person to reach out to. That's her email there. I knew her when she used to be in private practice. There's the Hennepin County Multicultural Services Center. There's a number there. The Immigrant Refugees and Affairs Program. I also know Emilio Lijo. Before he went to work for St. Paul, he was in private practice. Also a good guy to get a hold of about their potential services, and he may have some suggestions, as would Michelle. And then there's Lawyers for Good Government. There's a link there for their help with the TPS Ukrainian project. And I also provide the uscis.gov website because that's your source mainly for forms. You have to be careful. While they do provide information there about various types of things that you can and can't do, you need to be careful about some of the information can be out of date. And it also doesn't completely disclose all the policies or exactly how they adjudicate things. And that's ultimately why I suggest that if you want an evaluation of someone's individual immigration options, that you go and get an evaluation from an experienced immigration lawyer, either in the wider range of private lawyers that are available, or these local resources where you can coordinate and get some pro bono help if that's appropriate. I also wanted to touch on one other thing. A couple of questions I know came in. So if people are here in B status, the thing to remember about being in B status is that you cannot work in the United States if you are in B status. It's a temporary status. You're allowed to stay for a while. You can, if you have maintained your B status, apply to change your non-immigrant status to another status. For instance, if you were to be accepted into a college or university, you got your I-20, you couldn't start your schooling, but you could apply potentially for a change to F1 status, provided you can demonstrate how you're going to pay for your schooling and so forth. That could be an option. And depending on your circumstances, and it could be, you could do all those things in conjunction with pursuing TPS as well. The thing to know about all of these programs is none of these are going to be instantaneous decisions. Particularly the EADs, you could be the employment authorization documents, so the document that allows you to go to work once you're here, you could be waiting a few months for that to show up. Admittedly, the Biden administration is trying to improve on the abysmal Trump administration track record, and it still has some room for improvement. It's working on it, but it's by no means are any of these things instantaneous, and so you're probably, some of these programs are too new for me to guess as to how long it's going to take for some of these decisions to be made. But my guess is you'll be waiting potentially longer than you'd like to. Months generally is not unheard of. And with that, I think there were at least 2 questions that I know of. One was, if a Ukrainian was here in the United States, but had failed to maintain status, could they apply for TPS, or could they apply for Unite for Ukraine? Well, you cannot apply for Unite for Ukraine because the person is here in the United States. So if they're here in the United States, they're gonna stay here in the United States. Uniting for Ukraine, the humanitarian parole program is not going to work for them, probably, because one of the factors of being in Uniting for Ukraine humanitarian parole is that you have to be outside the United States. They may or may not qualify for TPS. I don't know enough information, but one of the key things to be mindful of is, have they been continuously present in the United States since April 11th? And some of their other options may be determined by how they came here to the United States, if they're admitted lawfully, in what status, and then what issues came up that failed to maintain. That might not impact their TPS, but it might impact some of their other options that they might have related to maintaining some kind of non-immigrant status, or their ability to, it would depend on what happened. They may or may not be out of status. That would be something that would need to be evaluated by the immigration lawyer in a confidential consultation. The other question I got was, would people coming on parole on the Uniting for Ukraine qualify for various state, federal, and local social benefits programs? And I have to admit to you that what the qualifications are for 50 different states' benefits programs. Benefits law is a separate area of law that, and I don't practice in that area. My advice would be that you may want to ask attorneys at ILCM or Advocates for Human Rights, or the local government services folks that I have in my list. Those people are good sources, because if they don't know the answer themselves, they probably know somebody who can help you answer that question. That aside, I will also just highlight what just because I want to be cautious here, particularly when it comes to taking benefits. The United States is not particularly generous with social benefits, even to its poor U.S. citizens. That's just a fact. Particularly if you compare to many European countries. That's just kind of the way things have been. For instance, we don't have universal health care. That healthcare here is a kaleidoscope of various options, which is vastly different from how healthcare is managed by most European countries. With that in mind, and also taking in mind that the prior administration, the Trump administration, is not that far behind us, and they had proposed a pretty draconian public charge rule, which was defeated in court and is no longer in effect. That's the good news. The bad news is the public charge statute is still around, and the old way that they applied it from the 1999 interim guidance rules are still around. So it can still be an issue if people have taken certain cash benefits, could be an issue when pursuing certain forms of permanent residence. depending on the kind of status that you had at the time that you took them. For instance, people who are designated resettled refugees, asylees, generally not an issue. But others could run into issues, and you need to understand which kind of benefits fall into that. But the other thing that the other reason I bring up this caution is the Trump Republican Party is still very much anti-immigrant. And the vein in that party that led to the public benefit rule that they proposed, those people are still around. And in the event that they were to win the presidency, even if it isn't Mr. Trump, it's another Republican, you would want to be careful about what their platform said, because my guess is they could try and bring back a reinvention of the public charge rule. And I don't mean to say this as being scary. I just mean to say this, that it's a vein that exists and runs through our politics. And so if you're here and you're trying to apply for benefits, you need to, and you're not a US citizen, lawful permanent resident, asylee, or resettled refugee, you need to be careful, and you need to get good counsel before you do that about what the long-term and short-term effects are, and also obviously whether you qualify given whatever your immigration status is for that particular benefit. So with that, I will, I know that was a long-winded answer and probably one you didn't want to hear, but
That's
I
perfect,
think,
George. We had that question from a lot of people. So essentially, people wondering what are the options for social benefits when they're here and things of that nature. And I think you addressed it in your first point. You said be careful compared to what other European countries have to offer for refugees.
yeah, because they tend to, generally speaking, kind of from the 50,000 foot level. And granted, I'm not an expert on European country benefits any more than anyone else, but my understanding is generally that the benefits in Europe are generally pretty good. And well, let's put it this way: they're good enough that lots of people from Syria really wanted to have them, right? And they made a tough, many of them braved tough terrain to make it there, and many still try to cross not Syrians necessarily, but Libyans try to cross from Libya in boats to get those benefits. Ukrainian refugees, I understand that individual countries may have some particular rules that aren't great, or you may have reasons that you want to come to the United States. And for work or for family, that may be your best option. And the important thing is just to kind of evaluate what your options are, so that you understand what they are before you make any big decisions. And let's just hope the war is over sometime soon. And
absolutely.
And then the rebuilding
George,
will begin.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know we are at time. I just wanted to make sure that we covered the topics that you wanted to share with us, with the Ukrainian community in Minnesota. I wanted to ask you if you'd like to share your contact information in case anyone would like to get in touch with you.
Sure. Yes, people can get in touch with me by calling our firm number 612-321-0082, and then basically just that's our firm general number. And you just need to ask to get on my calendar or Scott Breen's calendar or Gene Kildow's calendar for a meeting. All right.
Perfect, George. Well, thank you so much for this is very comprehensive. A lot of resources. We'll share this with several platforms. And again, we're hoping to have maybe a live interview in the future.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to a live event. And maybe
Absolutely.
I'll have some good news or new developments to share, or at least some estimations for how long it's taking them to process these applications. As I mentioned earlier, these things are less than a month old, so no one has more than a reasonable guess how long it's taking them to do any of these. Okay. And the other thing to know is if somebody runs out and said, I got my I-134 processed in a week. Well, that may be true at the very beginning, but as those pile up, it won't be true for long. It'll all depend on what their staffing levels are.
Great. Well, George, thank you so much for tonight's session. We are hoping to work with you and see you again in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.